Good evening. A change of guard in Beijing as a party congress held every 5 years has unveiled China's new leadership. The country's all-powerful Communist Party on Thursday unveiled a new 7-man leadership council steered by Xi Jinping to take command of the world's #2 economy for the next decade. Jinping's partner for the next decade will be Li Keqiang, whose promotion puts him in line to be appointed the country's premier in charge of China's day-to-day economic administration in March. The country's new leadership is tasked with multiple challenges which range from addressing a worrying deceleration of the country's economic growth. China recently has also had severe internal problems, starting with localized unrest sparked mainly by public outrage at large-scale corruption and abuse of official power by party officials. China's economy, heavily dependent on its powerful manufacturing strength, has been largely successful in alleviating poverty, at least in urban centers. But the party acknowledges the model is becoming unsustainable as the economy matures and demands for higher living standards grow. The big question, of course, that remains is how the new leadership under Xi Jinping will address these challenges in the next few years. The outgoing leader Hu Jintao has already stressed that the country's economy must get away from a reliance on exports and investment with more focus on private enterprise and consumer demand. Many people believe that Xi's assumption of military leadership from day one will stand to strengthen his hand to deal with the country's problems. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight on The Big Picture, we discuss the transition in Beijing. We'll also discuss the challenges that have been outlined very publicly by the CPC for the next decade, and indeed the ones that are not so well publicized. Joining me tonight in the studio will be Parthasarthy, former ambassador, also Baladas Ghoshal from the Center for Policy Research, and Srikant Kondapalli, professor of Chinese Studies at JNU. We'll also have another guest in just a bit, but we'll introduce him as he joins us. I'd like to start the show with Mr. Parthasarthy, if I could. The transition ends months of internal rivalry, speculation, secrecy, no doubt, and will determine the country's future at a time when China seems to be grappling with economic problems. Now, not much is known about Xi Jinping, apart from his early life, something the party has guarded fiercely. His views on a lot of important issues are still something of an unknown quantity. What do we really know about Xi Jinping, apart from the fact that he was the consensus candidate who pipped Hu Jintao's preferred successor to the post?
Well, I think really the important thing in this party congress was, which we saw for the first time of this nature, was a former leader nominally out of power, Jiang Zemin, appear on the center stage and virtually the center stage. What one sees is an era of remarkable economic growth, and let's not underestimate China's achievements under Hu Jintao. Now, the fact of the matter is this has inevitably produced social tensions. In an internet age, people are clamoring for more information. There is huge corruption. I mean, the Bozilai affair revealed that the person had accumulated billions of dollars. His faction retaliated by revealing that Premier Wen Jiabao's family has got over $2 billion of wealth. So there is corruption, there is rivalry, there is no doubt about that. Xi Jinping himself is no slouch. His family has supposed to have hundreds of millions of dollars. All of them, interestingly, send their children to American universities like Harvard for education. So it is an elitist rule, hardly communist, and it is producing social tensions. Now, seeing the way that Li Yunshan has been appointed as head of the propaganda department, a man who favors clamp down on internet, clamp down on communication, quite obviously there is going to be a tussle between those who would like to open out, like Yu Zhengshang, the Shanghai party chief who favors rule of law, favors privatization, and this conservative faction. The conservatives generally presently hold this sway.
Right, right.
And we'll really, there are two things. Internally, how they are going to handle this contradiction, and as you yourself said, emerging social and economic tensions. More importantly, they are becoming, as tensions grow, they seem to be diverting attention by external aggressive postures vis-a-vis all their Asia-Pacific neighbors. And I think India would find a more assertive, strong and unyielding position on the border. So that's it.
More on that in just a bit. I also like to address one particular point that you made. There were two important officials left out of this seven-member top leadership. But I'll come to Professor Kondapalli on that. Before that, I want to go to Baladas, Ghoshal and ask you this. Any changes to the system envisioned by Xi Jinping are likely to be constrained, would you agree, by several older party members who surround him now? They're all older than him, mid-60s, late 60s. The body, this seven-member body now effectively, very conservatively is expected to run the country. Do you think the fact that Xi Jinping took over military commander, supreme commander of the army from day one, will help stabilize his position within the party hierarchy?
You see, from my perspective, this is basically an elitist game. I don't think there has been any major change. I mean, there has been change of names in terms of leadership. But in terms of the policy choices and others, you don't have any idea as yet, because nobody tries to talk about it before the things are settled. Everybody tries to hide their things because they're afraid they might lose the leadership struggle in that. So when you look at the leadership, the character of the leadership, it is not very different from the earlier ones. Now, you talked about Xi Jinping's assuming military, command, that one. Now, I don't think any of the other 5 members of the standing committee owe their position to Xi Jinping.
It's either Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin.
I mean, all of them have their own patrons. Now, in such a situation, I think Xi Jinping will also have to face the same problem in terms of building up a consensus and trying to work out something which doesn't really antagonize the other interests within the party.
It's not an easy path.
So it's basically, the whole exercise from my point of view is just an exercise by the party leadership to craft a policy and a kind of a structure in which they're able to retain the party's dominance as well as the individual interests of the elites.
Right. Coming to Professor Kondapalli now, Mr. Parthasarthy mentioned that there are several people who are left out of this particular seven-man top leadership team, if you could call it that. Left out from the final lineup were 2 one-time contenders associated with reform. One was Wang Yang, the party chief in southern Guangdong province, and Li Yuanshao, the former party chief in Jiangsu province, and also the head of the party's organization department. With Wang and Li both out, a lot of people will be disappointed according to analysts, and they will see no reform hope in this particular team. As these two are considered pro-reform, would you say that's a fair assessment, that there will be disappointment around China?
Well, I think Wang Yang had been associated soon after the last year September Wuhan uprising, when a whole village of 16,000 people demonstrated against the party officials. Wang Yang tried to douse the feelings of the cadres, and he reinstituted several other committees dismissing the local party cadres. So there has been a move for political reform by Wang Yang in this village, and that has been projected as a Kwangtung model in a way to the other parts. And like Premier Wen Jiabao had mentioned at Davos and other places, that political reform will be instituted. Nevertheless, we haven't seen any major progress in the political reform aspects. The party Congress work report also suggests to the party reform and the country's reform, political reform. Yet we haven't been able to see the ABCDs of that reform so far. So leaving out Wang Yang would be definitely disappointing for the liberals in the Chinese political scene. I also want to get back to the Xi Jinping's military position from day one. This is a sea change. It basically reflects that Hu Jintao didn't have complete control over the party. It also indicates that while Jiang Zemin was the CMC, Central Military Commission chairman, for 2 more years.
After the transition.
After the transition in the 2002 to 4, and gave up only after 2 years. The fact that President Hu Jintao gave up the CMC position indicates that Jiang Zemin's role is visible. Secondly, that Xi Jinping, his tenure in the Ministry of National Defense under Kang Piao in the 1980s had paid him well in terms of getting this position. So I think his hands are strengthened now in terms of the Shanghai faction in the saddle.
Right.
Previously, the Communist Youth League had about 50 seats in the 200 and odd Central Committee members. Now, the Communist Youth League, which is a major faction, is considerably declined.
Right.
While Shanghai Gang had increased its hold, which means basically then that we will see a lot more reform in the economic domain, if not in the political domain.
Right. Hold that thought. I want to introduce one more guest that has just joined us. Pramit Chaudhri is the Foreign Affairs Editor with Hindustan Times. He's just joined us. You heard the conversation I had with Professor Kondapalli and the guest before. Baladas Ghoshal, who's sitting right next to me, believes that this is just, this is not really a transition to pro-reform or anything, because we haven't seen any pro-reform noises, first of all, coming there. Do you think it's just a transition with it's basically old wine in a new bottle, and that Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang perhaps will continue the policies of the previous Communist Party chief?
Well, I think there are two different types of schools of reform here. One is economic and one is political. On the political side, I would agree. I don't think there's going to be much change for all their talk and occasional talk about it. But you can see the speeches in the party congress have generally been, we will not accept a Western model. The party is sacrosanct in terms of its authority. There's no budge, no movement on that front. And I think there's a consensus within the party right now that they cannot afford to allow any opening up on the political side. The economic side is a slightly different story. There, I would argue, there's a consensus for change. There is a recognition among all of them that they are going to have to adjust to a slower growing economy that will still grow very fast, but will not be in double digits, will be driven by a declining investment cycle. You will face high labor costs. And this readjustment of that economy, and to ensure, for example, that the economy does not go back into another real estate bubble, I think there's a consensus there. And actually pushing through the reforms on the economic side is going to be where Xi Jinping has to show his ability to put together actual policy reform and bringing in all of the various factions. But at the heart of it, and I think Dr. Kondapalli correctly mentioned, is that the Jiang Zemin faction has come out remarkably strong, I would argue, in the present standing committee.
Pramit, very briefly, if you could, I want to mention these two names again. Wang Yang, who's been left out of the top team as well, as one more functionary, Li Yuanshao. People think that these two pro-reform voices, pro-reform faces didn't find any place in the top team. Do you think that can hamper the economic reform agenda that you just mentioned? And Xi Jinping's hand will be restrained because he doesn't have these two officials who are largely seen as pro-reform.
Well, as I said, I would argue that those two represent more a political reform agenda. As I said, I don't think there's a disagreement on the economic reform side. But what's clear is that probably, I think, would argue 4 out of the 7 standing committee members are closely associated with Jiang Zemin and the Shanghai faction.
Right.
And they're going to be driven by the need to change the economy, because that's really what Shanghai is all about. And the political reform agenda is now essentially not really on the table at all. But keep this in mind. I think 5 out of these 7 members will retire in 2017. At that point, if Xi Jinping can play his cards right, and in particular, if he can get through the economic transition which China is now going to have to undergo, he may be in a much better position to move the reform agenda into something political.
Right.
It's difficult to talk what Xi himself believes, but there's some evidence that he accepts that the political system has to change, but he doesn't have the ability, and right now in an economic transition, the Chinese system never considers political reform.
Right. We'll take a small break, gentlemen. We'll come back, and I'd like to speak about more internal squabblings within the CPC, also internal factionalism going on, all that and more on the other side of this break. Keep watching The Big Picture. welcome back to the big picture. Mr. Parthasarthy, analysts believe that the Chinese public may start to express some dissatisfaction over the dominance of so-called prince-lings, or sons of revolutionary leaders who have risen to high posts within the CPC. Also the fact that retired leaders Jiang Zemin's increased interference in the process of succession was quite apparent even in this particular case. Do you think these two factors will stoke anti-establishment feelings of any sort to some extent inside China?
Look, you must remember one thing, that Jiang Zemin is a protege like Hu Jintao or Deng Xiaoping. Now, Deng was very clear that the Soviet Union collapsed because of Gorbachev's half-baked ideas on perestroika without really moving the economy upwards. So Deng's recipe was totally different. Liberalize economy, make Chinese who love being rich, rich, and you go about it. So that I can't see the Chinese leadership changing from. I would even go to the extent of saying that a large number of these reformers will want a greater private sector role apart from anything else that enriches them. By and large, they are discreet about their wealth, but no longer so. There's a lot of flaunting of wealth. Their real dilemma, and they will themselves still be debating, on how not to go the Gorbachev way of weakening the party setup, which is what Gorbachev did in his perestroika, but yet be able to accommodate change in a manner and pace which retains what they call as socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Right.
So they are not going to move towards the multi-party system. I don't think it suits the Chinese civilizational way. They are historically authoritarian. So really, you are going to have tensions, blow-ups. I mean, that's a given. The question is how they are able to work out their leadership to manage this.
Right. So that is the big question.
That's a big question.
Absolutely.
Which we really
Dr. Baladas, Ghoshal, let me ask you this. This is by far the most peaceful transition, or so analysts believe, and of institutionalized transition of power in the PRC's history. Now, Hu Jintao made it a point to step down on its own when it was time, unlike Jiang Zemin, who continued 2 years after the 16th Party Congress. Are we then seeing signs of what some people would call institutional improvement within China's rigid and secret party structure?
Institutional improvement within quotes, because this is not an open and legitimate system of transition, because this basically remains within the elite. They decide what is needed to be done in the country. So if you talk about this as an institutional one, then of course it is, in a sense, that this has assumed some kind of an institutional status. But then there's always uncertainty in this kind of a thing, because it's not a legitimate and open kind of a system, and this remains basically within the realm of elite politics.
Shrouded in secrecy.
In secrecy. So you cannot really call it a kind of an institutional change in that sense of the term. But knowing that Chinese are very pragmatic, and also given the fact, as Ambassador Parthasarthy also mentioned, about their emphasis on economic development and the recent decline in the growth and all that, they will keep that in mind, that economic growth is very important for even political legitimacy within the country.
Right.
So from that perspective, I think you can call it a kind of a change. It will not upset. They would not like to, upset anything within the system at this moment.
Right.
So from that perspective, you can call it some kind of an institutional shift.
So steady as she goes, but change wherever we can.
But from a theoretical perspective, you can't call it a kind of institutional shift.
I want to put the same question to Professor Kondapalli. Do you think quote-unquote institutional improvement, is that the right way of looking at it?
Well, actually, there are a lot of factional struggles within the Communist Party, and there are some institutions which have been in practice from 1935 in the Communist Party. Hardly anything changed. So, from that point of view, the organizational structure remained almost kind of monolithic, with adjustments from the forces from below. For example, the higher company representative also became a member of the Central Committee. Private entrepreneurs, some 27 of them have become part of the Central Committee. This is unimaginable, say, 20, 30 years before. So there has been some readjustment within the institutional structure to include the private entrepreneurs. This came up during Chiang Zemin's time. It has been instituted again during Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping's tenures. So there have been some adjustments. Secondly, in the previous administration of Hu Jintao, there was also the health minister who is not a party member, and the education minister as well didn't have the party connection. So they have also brought in the non-party people to become heads of the ministries.
So as opposed to earlier when only people from the youth wing would rise up through the ranks and then be elevated to party positions.
Only party members would become the ministers or in places of high position. But today there is a change, a slight change in institutional mechanisms. So that's one, I think, keeping in time with the time, they have been able to change their institutional structures. But overall, there has been, the uncertainty is also about the factional struggles. For example, most of the powers of Hu Jintao have been clipped, partly because there has been the Poshilai incident impact. For example, 3 days after the Poshilai incident came up, one of the close associates of Hu Jintao, Ling Chi-hua, his son was involved in a Ferrari accident in Beijing. With the result that Ling Chi-hua was not able to make it to the CPPCC, which is a consultative body. There was a rumor that Chow Yun-kang, who was part of the previous Politburo Standing Committee and in charge of the internal security, he exposed the Ferrari incident because hardly we get any news. And if news is indeed planted in the press, there is a certain motive behind it. So which indicated that the factional struggle had intensified post Poshilai expose. So that brings us to the whole question whether this system is stable, whether this
or not.
Absolutely.
I want to go to Pramit very quickly and ask you this. What should one really expect from China's new leadership in terms of relations and stances towards its territorial neighbors? Also, China is involved in multiple disputes with neighbors such as India, South and North Korea both, and other nations like Vietnam and Philippines. Do you see a significant shift in policy at all by this new leadership?
Traditionally, China has been assertive and aggressive in a run-up to the National People's Congress. This has often been aimed at the United States. This time it seems to be aimed at the US allies and to some degree Vietnam. The expectation on past behavior is that we will see a certain quietening of Chinese foreign policy for a while without any real shift at the basic disputes or the Chinese positions on these disputes. But what we may be, the real question is Chinese foreign policy assertiveness driven by the weakness of or the squabbling within its party leadership? If that is the case, and if the present party Congress and the makeup of the Standing Committee indicates that that weakness continues, we should start to see a new round of assertiveness at some point within China, within Chinese foreign policy, driven partly by this, partly by a perceived weakness regarding the United States and allies like Japan, and just the fact that China will continue to rise in strength over the next 10 years, even if its economy slows down a bit.
Ambassador Parthasarthy, you heard what Pramit just said. What about the US then? The Obama administration has been trying to cultivate some sort of a relationship with the new leadership. Joe Biden even came on a highly publicized, lengthy visit where I think the new party leaders played host. How do you see the new leadership tackling the US? And remember, Barack Obama has no fear of re-election anymore and is expected to be a much tougher president in his second term.
No, I think I have a slight disagreement with Pramit in the sense that I believe that the Chinese become assertive and aggressive when they want to divert people's attention from what is the shortcomings at home and the dissatisfaction at home. That is the primary cause. The extent of assertiveness, to my mind, will be determined by domestic factors and how well they succeed in dealing with domestic challenges. Having said that, their relationship of greatest importance is the United States. Let's make no mistakes. They realize that they have a long, long way to go before they can match America in terms of military power. But they're going to push the button with the Philippines, with Vietnam, and with Japan on their maritime disputes, just to prove to American allies that you cannot depend totally on America.
Right.
We are around, you'll have to make your peace with us.
Absolutely. I want to put the same question to you, but briefly, sir, China's position, where do you see them, how do you see them tackling the US?
I think it won't change very much. It will remain the same. Again, I would say that, as Ambassador Parthasarthy said, that it will depend also on its domestic politics to a certain extent. But the basic things about China's foreign policy, that remains more or less the same. They might blow hot and cold on certain issues, but I think the basic principles or basic approaches, they don't want to shift.
Absolutely. Very briefly, Professor Kondapalli, what should India expect? Any takeaways from India, from the 7-member team and their backgrounds and what we've just discussed?
I just wanted to quickly also say that the assertiveness of China comes mainly from nationalism, which is pretty high in the Chinese cyberspace. Secondly, from the military, which is pushing the patriotic envelope further. On US role and China, Xi Jinping made a comment in Mexico, which is very instructive for the discussion today, where he said these people with pot bellies are saying that China is impacting on everybody. He said that we are not exporting revolution, we are not exporting poverty, we are not exporting devastation, etc. So it basically indicated his frustration with the United States, ideological conflict with the United States. In terms of India, I think some of the things that could impact on India is, number one, Xi Jinping's policy of reform, economic reform, would impact in terms of the investments profile in India. We have seen over $50 billion investments in project works in the telecom and the energy sectors. This is going to go up in the future. Secondly, in terms of the Tibet military modernization, China is going to play up this aspect, and this is going to be a major concern for India.
Absolutely,
because he had taken over. Xi Jinping had taken over the Tibet Work Forum meetings early last year.
Right. So I must end the program there. I would have liked to ask Pramit Chaudhri a question, but we're completely out of time. We'll have to close the show at this point. Of course, Li Keqiang, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, will of course also be an important factor, along with Xi Jinping, who is of course slated to be the chief, the supreme commander of China very soon. India will have to wait and watch what really to expect. Otherwise, my guests believe no real policy change or shift in stance. Yes, they can become aggressive, but that's of course a trait that the Chinese have showed over the past multiple decades. That's all the time we have on The Big Picture. Till next time, Athar saying goodbye, good night, and thank you for watching.